The salt-stained windows of the Tampa police station reflected the tired eyes of Detective Marcus Webb on that humid October morning in 1941. 23 years. That's how long the Eleanor Hartwell case had haunted this city, collecting dust in a filing cabinet on the third floor while life moved on around it. Eleanor had been 26 years old when she vanished from the Ybor City marketplace on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving behind nothing but whispers and a mother's unrelenting grief. Marcus was 52 now, close to retirement, with calloused hands and a liver-spotted face that told the story of too many sleepless nights pursuing ghosts. He'd inherited the Hartwell file 5 years ago from Detective Sullivan, who'd passed it along like a cursed relic. Most cops didn't want it. The case had consumed Sullivan's career, turned him bitter and alcoholic, and eventually landed him in an early grave at 61. Marcus understood why they avoided it. Some mysteries seemed designed to break you from the inside. But Marcus had never been good at letting go. The morning had started like any other, with lukewarm coffee and the weight of paperwork. He was reviewing arrest records from the 1930s, a routine he'd performed hundreds of times, when something caught his eye. A name, a face in a mugshot. A man named Thomas Greville, arrested in 1940 for vagrancy in Jacksonville, carrying a woman's jewelry he couldn't adequately explain. The description matched partially. Dark hair, tall, strong build. But what made Marcus's pulse quicken wasn't the jewelry or the vague physical similarity. It was the address listed on the arrest report. Greville had been living 3 blocks from where Eleanor Hartwell's body had been found in 1939. Not reported missing until 1941, but discovered buried beneath the floorboards of an abandoned warehouse during renovation work. Marcus had learned long ago not to trust coincidences. Coincidences were the universe playing tricks on the lazy-minded. He spent the next 6 hours digging through records, cross-referencing names, dates, and movements. Greville had disappeared from Jacksonville in 1940, right after that arrest. No subsequent records, no new arrests, nothing. It was as if he'd simply evaporated, which in a way suggested guilt. A man running, a man with something to hide. By noon, Marcus had made a decision. He contacted the Jacksonville Police Department and discovered something remarkable. Thomas Greville had recently surfaced. He was working as a dock hand in Fort Pierce, living under an assumed name, Thomas Gray. But an observant patrol officer had noticed the resemblance during a routine check and ran the fingerprints out of curiosity. The fingerprints matched. 23 years later, Thomas Greville was still in Florida, just 50 miles away, living a quiet life as if he'd never murdered a young woman and buried her like garbage beneath rotting wood and darkness. The drive to Fort Pierce took 3 hours. Marcus drove alone, his old Chevrolet rattling along the coastal highway, the Atlantic Ocean glimmering to his right like a mirror reflecting a sky too blue for a day that felt this heavy with consequence. He'd learned not to get his hopes up. Evidence deteriorated. Witnesses died or forgot. The legal system was a beast with appetites that didn't always align with justice. But Eleanor Hartwell's mother, Ruth, was still alive. She lived in a small house near Hyde Park, visiting her daughter's grave every Sunday without fail, according to the local priest. Ruth deserved an answer. At 78, she might not have many more Sundays left. Thomas Greville, or Thomas Gray, as the dock workers called him, was a thin man with gray threading through his dark hair and a tremor in his left hand that suggested either age or guilt or some combination of both. He was loading cargo onto a merchant vessel when Marcus found him, muscles straining beneath a sweat-soaked shirt, his movements methodical and careful. Marcus watched him for 10 minutes from a distance, studying the way Greville moved, the way he avoided eye contact with his coworkers, the way he seemed to inhabit the world as if he didn't quite belong to it. When Marcus finally approached, Greville's face went white. Not the white of innocent surprise. The white of a man watching his past materialize before him in the form of a detective with cold eyes and a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Thomas Greville? Marcus's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 2 decades. Greville's hands stilled on the cargo crate. For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly he turned around. His eyes met Marcus's, and in that meeting, something ancient and terrible seemed to pass between them. Recognition. Reckoning. The end of a long, exhausting game. "I don't know that name," Greville said, but his voice cracked like dry earth. "Yes, you do," Marcus replied. "And I think you know why I'm here too." The arrest happened without struggle. Greville seemed almost relieved, as if carrying the weight of Eleanor Hartwell's ghost for 23 years had been a sentence he'd been waiting all along to serve. He didn't resist when Marcus read him his rights. He didn't protest when they put him in the back of the police car. He simply sat in silence, staring out the window at the ocean receding behind them, his trembling left hand pressed against his thigh, as if trying to hold something in. The news spread through Tampa like wildfire. Within hours, every newspaper from Jacksonville to Miami had picked it up. The cold case that had defined a generation of detective work had finally produced an arrest. Eleanor Hartwell's photograph appeared in the afternoon editions. A young woman with gentle eyes and a tentative smile, forever 26, frozen in time. The community that had moved on, that had relegated the mystery to the realm of urban legend and ghost story, suddenly remembered. They remembered Eleanor. They remembered the fear that had gripped Ybor City in 1939 when her body was discovered. They remembered the promise that justice would eventually arrive. And now it had, in the form of a tired old detective and a man who'd been running so long he'd almost forgotten what he was running from. Morrison drove back to Harlan with Ruth Palmer's words echoing in his mind. "Somewhere no one knows your name." He had handled dozens of missing persons cases, and that phrase had a specific weight to it. Not the desperation of someone running from danger, but the deliberate choice of someone seeking invisibility. Back at the station, Morrison pulled every document from Margaret's file and spread them across his desk. Birth certificate, school records, employment history, witness statements, Thomas Bennett's testimony. He read them all again, this time looking for what wasn't there rather than what was. Thomas Bennett had been interviewed 5 times in the weeks after Margaret's disappearance. Morrison read each transcript carefully. The words were consistent, too consistent, like a script rehearsed until perfect. Thomas claimed he last saw Margaret at 6 p.m. on November 13th when he dropped her at her parents' house after dinner at his family's estate. He said she seemed happy, excited, maybe a little tired from wedding preparations. But Ruth Palmer's account contradicted that timeline. She had been with Margaret until 7:30 p.m. that evening, helping her pack the small suitcase she would take on their honeymoon to Gatlinburg. If Thomas had dropped Margaret off at 6 p.m., where had she been for that hour and a half? Morrison picked up the phone and called the county clerk's office. He needed to know who else had been interviewed who might still be alive to talk. The clerk, a woman named Vera who had worked there since Roosevelt's first term, promised to pull the records. While he waited, Morrison drove to the old Bennett estate. The property had changed hands twice since Patricia Bennett's death. A family from Louisville owned it now, used it as a summer retreat. The current owners, a couple named Harrison, were gracious when Morrison explained his purpose. "We bought it in 1974, Mr. Harrison said, leading Morrison through rooms that still held the ghost of old wealth. High ceilings, crown molding, a curved staircase that belonged in a movie. The Bennetts left most of the furniture. We found boxes in the attic, papers and things. We almost threw them out, but my wife insisted on storing them in the barn. Said it felt wrong to destroy someone's history." Morrison's pulse quickened. "May I see them?" The barn smelled of hay and motor oil. Cardboard boxes lined the back wall, some deteriorating, others surprisingly intact. Morrison pulled them into the light one by one. Tax documents, business correspondence, society pages from the Harlan Daily Enterprise featuring Patricia Bennett at various charitable functions, always perfectly dressed, always with that tight smile. Then Morrison found it. A leather-bound journal, smaller than his hand, tucked inside a hatbox. Patricia Bennett's personal diary. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. The entries dated back to 1938, written in precise cursive. January 15, 1938. "Thomas has formed an attachment to that Whitfield girl. I've seen her type before, pretty enough but common. She works with her hands. I must guide him toward someone more suitable. The Carson girl would be a much better match. Her father owns half the coal rights in the county." March 3, 1938. Thomas refuses to listen to reason about the Whitfield girl. He claims he loves her. Love. As if love pays for the lifestyle he's accustomed to. I've worked too hard to build this family's position to watch him throw it away on a seamstress. Morrison flipped forward, scanning entries. Patricia's obsession with controlling her son's life bled through every page. Then he reached November 1940. November 10th, 1940. 4 days until the wedding. I've made my position clear to Margaret during our final fitting. I explained exactly how things would be once she becomes a Bennet. No more working. No more unsuitable friends. She will dress appropriately, speak appropriately, host appropriately. She looked at me with those large eyes and said nothing. Good. She's learning her place. November 12th, 1940. Margaret came to the house this evening asking to speak with me privately. Thomas was at the mine office. She was trembling, poor thing. Said she needed to discuss the wedding arrangements. I invited her into the parlor and offered tea. She declined. Then she said the most ridiculous thing. She wanted to postpone the wedding. Said she and Thomas needed more time to plan their future together. I couldn't help but laugh. I told her the truth plainly. The deposits are paid. The guests are invited. My son's reputation is at stake. She would walk down that aisle on November 14th even if I had to drag her there myself. She started to cry, saying she felt trapped, that she loved Thomas but couldn't live under my rules. I explained that love is a luxury for people who can afford it. She married into this family. She would learn to be grateful. She left in tears, hysterical. Thomas came home an hour later and I told him Margaret had stopped by but left quickly. Said she was tired from preparations. He seemed satisfied with that explanation. Men are so easily fooled. Morrison's jaw clenched as he read. He turned the page. November 13th, 1940. Margaret returned this morning. I was having coffee on the veranda when I saw her walking up the drive. Looking determined. She carried a small bag. She said she was returning the engagement ring and calling off the wedding. Said she would rather work in the dress shop her whole life than live in a golden cage. I couldn't allow that, of course. The embarrassment would be unbearable. Our family would be the subject of gossip for years. Thomas would be humiliated. I did what any mother would do to protect her son's future. I invited her inside, said we should discuss this calmly. I poured her tea, the special blend I keep for difficult situations. Within 20 minutes, she was drowsy. By the time Thomas came home for lunch, she was unconscious in the guest room upstairs. Morrison's breath caught. He forced himself to keep reading. Thomas panicked when he saw her. Started talking about calling a doctor. I had to be firm. I explained that Margaret was clearly unstable, having some kind of breakdown. That we needed to handle this quietly for everyone's sake. That I knew a private facility in Virginia where she could receive proper care until she came to her senses. He didn't want to do it. My sweet boy has always been too soft. But I reminded him of his responsibilities, his position, what people would say if his fiancée publicly rejected him the day before their wedding. Finally, he agreed. We waited until dark. Thomas drove while I sat in the back with Margaret. The facility was expecting us. I'd made arrangements that afternoon. Dr. Whitmore assured me that patients often came around with proper treatment. He said 6 months to a year of rest and therapy, and Margaret would be ready to fulfill her duties as Thomas's wife. The entry ended there. Morrison felt sick. He flipped through the remaining pages. Most were mundane social obligations, household management, complaints about servants. Then he found one final entry about Margaret. April 3, 1941. Received word from Dr. Whitmore. Margaret has proven resistant to treatment. She refuses to acknowledge that her place is with Thomas. She speaks of wanting to be free, to live her own life. Ridiculous notions. Dr. Whitmore suggests we consider long-term commitment. I've authorized whatever measures he deems necessary. Thomas must never know. He's finally beginning to accept that she's gone. Better he believes she ran away than know the truth. Better for everyone. Morrison closed the journal, his hands shaking with rage. For 38 years, Margaret Whitfield hadn't been missing. She'd been imprisoned, held against her will because she dared to want her own life. He grabbed the journal and drove straight to the station. Captain Henderson was in his office, reviewing reports. Carl Morrison said, breathless, "I found her. I know what happened to Margaret Whitfield." Henderson looked up, skeptical. After 40 years? Morrison placed the journal on the desk. Patricia Bennett kidnapped her, drugged her, committed her to a private psychiatric facility against her will. Thomas Bennett knew. He helped. Henderson's face went pale as he read. When he finished, he looked at Morrison with something like horror. "Do you know what you're saying? Thomas Bennett is one of the most respected men in this county. He's on the church board. He donates to the Children's Hospital." Morrison's voice was steel. He helped his mother imprison an innocent woman because she didn't want to marry him. "We need to find out if she's still alive. We need to find that facility in Virginia." Henderson made the call to the Virginia State Police that same evening. Morrison paced his office like a caged animal, unable to sit still, unable to stop thinking about Margaret Whitfield locked away for nearly 4 decades because she wanted to choose her own path. The Virginia investigation moved quickly once they had a name. Dr. Lawrence Whitmore had run a private psychiatric facility called Shenandoah Valley Rest Home outside Charlottesville. The place had closed in 1968 after state inspectors found numerous violations. Patients held without proper legal commitment orders, experimental treatments, suspicious deaths. Whitmore had lost his medical license and died in 1971. The facility's records had been seized and stored in state archives. Morrison drove to Richmond 3 days later with a court order. The archivist, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Peter Chun, led him through rows of boxes in a climate-controlled vault. "These are the Shenandoah files," Chun said. "I warn you, detective, what's in here is disturbing." Whitmore was a monster hiding behind a medical degree. Morrison opened the first box. Patient files, hundreds of them. Women mostly, committed by husbands, fathers, brothers for offenses like disobedience, hysteria, refusing marriage proposals, wanting divorces. The treatments described made Morrison's stomach turn: insulin shock therapy, ice baths, extended isolation, drugs that turn minds to mush. He searched through files alphabetically. Then he found it. A manila folder labeled Patient 127 MW, admitted November 13, 1940. Morrison's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was an intake form filled out in neat handwriting. Patient name: Margaret Whitfield, age 22, committed by Mrs. Patricia Bennett, future mother-in-law, and Mr. Thomas Bennett, fiancé. Diagnosis: acute hysteria, delusional thinking, inability to fulfill domestic obligations, recommended treatment. Extended rest, behavior modification therapy, sedation as needed. Attached to the intake form was a photograph. Margaret stared at the camera with hollow eyes, her wedding day glow replaced by something broken. Morrison recognized that look. He had seen it in prisoners of war, in hostages held too long. The look of someone whose spirit had been systematically destroyed. He flipped through the file. Progress notes written in Dr. Whitmore's spidery script painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as treatment. December 1940. Patient refuses to acknowledge error in canceling engagement. Increased sedation recommended. March 1941. Patient attempted escape. Placed in isolation ward. Patient claims she was kidnapped. Clearly delusional. June 1941. Patient has become withdrawn. Refuses to eat. Force feeding implemented. October 1941. Patient no longer protests treatment. Appears to have accepted situation. Mrs. Bennett inquired about discharge. Informed her patient requires continued care. Morrison noticed something strange in the later entries. The tone changed. Where early notes showed Whitmore complying with Patricia Bennett's wishes to keep Margaret compliant and imprisoned, later notes suggested something else. January 1943. Mrs. Bennett deceased. No further contact from Thomas Bennett. Patient appears more alert, engaging with staff. Recommend continued observation. July 1945. Patient has shown remarkable improvement. Assists with younger patients. Demonstrates kindness and clarity of mind. No signs of original diagnosis. However, discharge would require contact with family. No family contact in 4 years. November 1950. Patient MW has become indispensable to facility operations. She manages patient library, teaches reading to illiterate patients, provides comfort to new arrivals, has expressed no desire to leave facility. When asked about family, she says she has no family. 10 years here. She's built a life in this place. Morrison's heart ached reading it. Margaret had survived by becoming useful, by finding purpose even in imprisonment. But there was more. He flipped to the final entries. March 1968. State inspection imminent. Patient MW has been here 27 years without proper legal commitment. She was never legally committed at all, just brought here by third parties with no authority. This is a liability. Spoke with patient about situation. She showed no emotion. Said she had nowhere to go, no one waiting for her. Asked if she could stay and work as staff member instead of patient. Agreed to reclassify her as employee. April 1968. Facility ordered closed by state. All patients transferred to state hospital. Patient MW technically not a patient since March reclassification. She has chosen to relocate to Richmond. Provided letter of reference for employment. After 27 years, she walks out the front door a free woman. She's 50 years old. She never married Thomas Bennett, never lived the life they tried to force on her. But she never lived her own life either. What a waste. Morrison looked up at Chun. Is there any record of where she went? Any forwarding address? Chun checked the file. Here, there's a notation. Says she took a position at Richmond Public Library, main branch in May 1968. That was 11 years ago. She might still be there. Morrison's heart pounded. He could be an hour away from meeting a woman who had been missing for 38 years. A woman the world thought was dead or had run away. A woman who had been erased from her own life. If you're watching this and you're as stunned as I was discovering this truth, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Because what happens next, nobody in Harlan County could have predicted. The truth was about to come home, and it would shake that small mining town to its core. Morrison drove to the Richmond Public Library that same afternoon. The main branch was a beautiful old Carnegie building with marble columns and high arched windows. Inside, the smell of books and furniture polish created an atmosphere of quiet reverence. He approached the circulation desk where a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun was checking out books for a young mother with 2 small children. The woman's hands moved efficiently, stamping due dates, smiling at the children, asking if they enjoyed the picture books they'd chosen last week. Morrison waited until she finished. Then he stepped forward, and she looked up at him with eyes he recognized from a photograph taken 38 years ago. Older now, with lines around them, but the same unusual shade of gray-green. His throat went dry. Margaret Whitfield? The woman's hands stilled on the book she'd been about to shelve. Her face went pale, then composed itself with the careful control of someone who'd had decades to practice hiding emotion. No one has called me that name in a very long time, she said quietly. Her voice was soft but steady, with the slight mountain accent of eastern Kentucky still detectable beneath years of careful speech. I go by Margaret Winston now. Winston was my mother's maiden name. Morrison pulled out his badge. I'm Detective James Morrison, Harlan County Sheriff's Department. Ma'am, I've been investigating your disappearance. I know what happened to you. I know where you were. Margaret's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. Her hand went to her throat, fingers touching a simple silver necklace. After a long moment, she spoke. I was never missing, Detective. I was taken. There's a difference. Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions. And I need to tell you that the people responsible for what happened to you are still alive. Thomas Bennett still lives in Harlan. He's never been held accountable. Something flickered across Margaret's face. Pain, anger, resignation, all mixed together. She looked around the library, at the patrons browsing shelves, at the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, at the life she'd built from the ashes of the one that had been stolen from her. Detective Morrison, I was imprisoned for 27 years, because I didn't want to be someone's obedient wife. I was drugged, isolated, told I was insane for wanting my own life. When I finally got out, I was 50 years old. Everyone I loved was dead. My parents died thinking I'd abandoned them. My best friend moved on. The man who helped imprison me built a respectable life while I rotted in that place. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes held decades of pain. I've spent the last 11 years building something that's mine. I have an apartment. I have friends who know me as Margaret Winston, the kind librarian who recommends excellent books. I have peace. And now you're here to tell me I can have justice? Morrison nodded. Yes, ma'am. We can prosecute Thomas Bennett for kidnapping, false imprisonment. What he did to you was a crime. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. Detective Thomas Bennett has spent 38 years believing I escaped from him, that I chose freedom over him, that I was stronger than him and his mother. Do you know what that knowledge has cost him? He never married. He never found happiness. He's lived in that town under a cloud of shame and mystery. That's been my justice. Morrison leaned forward. But the truth needs to come out. Other people need to know what happened. Your story matters. Margaret looked at him with those gray-green eyes that had seen too much. Then tell it, detective. Tell the whole truth. But understand something. I'm not going back to Harlan. I'm not facing that man. I'm not becoming a spectacle for people who forgot about me decades ago. You want justice? Arrest him. But leave me out of it. I've already served my sentence. Morrison returned to Harlan with evidence that could destroy Thomas Bennett's carefully constructed life. He carried Patricia Bennett's diary, Dr. Whitmore's files, and the testimony of a woman who had lost 27 years to imprisonment. But Margaret's refusal to return, to face her captor, complicated everything. Captain Henderson reviewed the evidence with the county prosecutor, a sharp woman named Ellen Rodriguez who had moved to Harlan from Louisville 5 years earlier. She spread the documents across the conference table, reading each one with increasing disgust. This is ironclad, she said finally. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy. Even after all these years, there's no statute of limitations on kidnapping. We can prosecute, but our victim won't testify, Henderson pointed out. She's built a new life. She doesn't want to come back here. Rodriguez tapped Patricia Bennett's diary. We have her confession in writing. We have the facility records. We have Morrison's interview with Margaret confirming the facts. We don't need her to testify to get an indictment. Getting a conviction might be harder, but we can try. Morrison spoke up. There's something else. If we're going after Thomas Bennett, the whole town needs to know why. He's respected here. People won't understand unless they hear the full story. Henderson nodded slowly. You want to go public before the arrest. I want people to understand what he did, what his mother did. I want them to know Margaret Whitfield didn't run away. She was stolen. The story broke on October 3, 1979. The Harlan Daily Enterprise ran it as a front-page feature. Missing bride found alive after 38 years. Shocking truth behind 1940 disappearance revealed. Morrison had worked with the reporter, giving her access to the non-confidential parts of the investigation, ensuring Margaret's current location remained protected. The town erupted. People who had lived through the original disappearance couldn't believe what they were reading. Younger residents who had only heard the story as local legend were horrified by the truth. The church board immediately suspended Thomas Bennett. The hospital revoked his position on their charity committee. Morrison arrived at the Bennett house at 6 a.m. on October 4th with an arrest warrant. Thomas answered the door in his bathrobe, a 71-year-old man who looked older than his years. His face was gray, his hands shaking. He didn't ask why Morrison was there. He simply said, "So you found her." Morrison read him his rights. "Thomas Bennett, you're under arrest for kidnapping and false imprisonment of Margaret Louise Whitfield." He placed handcuffs on wrists that offered no resistance. In the car, Thomas spoke quietly. "Is she all right? Margaret, did she have a good life?" Morrison's jaw clenched. "She spent 27 years in a psychiatric facility because you and your mother couldn't accept her right to choose." "No, Mr. Bennett, she did not have a good life. Thomas closed his eyes. I was 23 years old. My mother she was a force. I couldn't stand up to her. I told myself Margaret would come around, that she'd be happy once we were married. When Mother said we needed to take her somewhere to rest, to calm down, I believed her. I thought it would be a few weeks. Morrison's voice was cold. The records show you stopped asking about her after 1943. You abandoned her there. My mother died in 1943. When I tried to contact the facility afterward, they said Margaret refused to see me, that she'd requested no contact with family. Dr. Whitmore said it was better to let her heal without reminders of her past. I convinced myself she was getting the help she needed. So you just moved on? Lived your life while she rotted in that place? Thomas's voice broke. I lived with the guilt every single day. Every wedding I saw, every happy couple, I thought of her. I never married because I knew I didn't deserve happiness. But I was a coward. I should have checked on her. I should have brought her home. Being sorry doesn't give her back the years you stole, Morrison said. The trial began in March 1980. The courtroom in the Harlan County Courthouse was packed every day. Reporters came from Louisville, Lexington, even as far as Cincinnati and Nashville. The case had captured public attention. A 40-year-old crime finally brought to light. A woman imprisoned for refusing marriage. A respected man revealed as a monster. Ellen Rodriguez built her case methodically. She entered Patricia Bennett's diary into evidence, reading entries aloud that made the courtroom gasp. She brought in Dr. Peter Chun from Virginia to testify about the facility records. She had Morrison describe his investigation, his discovery of the truth, his interview with Margaret. The defense attorney, an expensive lawyer named Marcus Caldwell from Louisville, argued that Thomas had been manipulated by his domineering mother, that he'd been young and under her control, that he'd believed Margaret was receiving legitimate medical care. He painted Thomas as another victim of Patricia Bennett's cruelty. But Rodriguez destroyed that argument with one piece of evidence, a letter dated August 1942, found in the facility files, from Thomas Bennett to Dr. Whitmore. Morrison had discovered it during a second review of the documents. Rodriguez read it aloud to the jury. Dear Dr. Whitmore, I trust Margaret is making progress in overcoming her unreasonable resistance to marriage and her proper role as my wife. My mother mentioned before her passing that you were helping Margaret understand her obligations. Please continue whatever treatment you deem necessary. I enclose a check for the next 6 months of her care. I trust that by next spring, she will be ready to fulfill her duties. Sincerely, Thomas Bennett. The courtroom was silent. Rodriguez turned to the jury. This is not a young man manipulated by his mother. This is a man paying to keep a woman imprisoned until she agrees to marry him. This is a man treating another human being like property he can warehouse until she becomes obedient. The defense had no response. Thomas sat at the defendant's table, his head in his hands. But the most powerful moment came when Rodriguez played a video deposition. Margaret had finally agreed to give testimony. Not in person, but recorded in Richmond with her face partially obscured to protect her privacy. Her voice filled the courtroom, steady and clear. My name is Margaret Louise Whitfield. On November 13, 1940, I went to Patricia Bennett's home to return my engagement ring and call off my wedding to her son Thomas. I was 22 years old. I wanted to work, to build my own business, to choose my own path. Mrs. Bennett drugged my tea. When I woke up, I was in a car with Thomas driving and Mrs. Bennett in the back seat. They took me to a facility in Virginia. Her voice wavered slightly but continued. I spent the next 27 years in that place. I was told I was insane for not wanting to be a wife. I was medicated, isolated, punished for insisting I'd been kidnapped. Thomas came to visit me 3 times in the first year. Each time he asked if I was ready to marry him. Each time I said no. After that, he stopped coming. The camera showed her hands clasped tightly together. I lost my 20s, my 30s, my 40s. I lost the chance to have children. I lost my parents. They died believing I'd abandoned them. I lost everything because I committed the crime of wanting my own life. Thomas Bennett may have been young and influenced by his mother, but he was never too young to know that what they did to me was wrong. He chose his comfort over my freedom. That is unforgivable. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Thomas Bennett guilty on all counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, conspiracy. The judge, a woman named Sarah Matthews who had presided over Harlan County courts for 15 years, delivered the sentence with barely concealed anger. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "you stole nearly 3 decades from Margaret Whitfield because she refused to surrender her autonomy to you. You robbed her of the chance to live the life she chose. While I cannot give her back those years, I can ensure you understand the weight of your crime." She sentenced him to 20 years in state prison. At 71, it was effectively a life sentence. Thomas showed no reaction. He simply nodded, accepting it as the debt finally come due. As deputies led him away, he stopped and turned toward the camera that had played Margaret's testimony. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't matter now. I know it doesn't change anything. But I'm sorry." The courtroom cleared slowly. People filed out in stunned silence, processing what they'd heard. Morrison stood on the courthouse steps, watching Harlan County residents try to reconcile the man they'd known for decades with the monster revealed in court. Ruth Palmer had attended every day of the trial. She approached Morrison on the steps, tears streaming down her face. "Can you tell her something for me? Can you tell Margaret that I never stopped believing she'd want to be found? That I never thought she ran away?" Morrison nodded. "I'll tell her." The weeks following the trial brought an avalanche of media attention. Margaret's story spread beyond Kentucky, picked up by national news outlets. Reporters called it a cautionary tale about the oppression of women, about autonomy and control, about crimes hidden in plain sight. Feminist groups praised Margaret's courage. Victims' rights organizations used the case to advocate for stronger protections. But Margaret herself remained in Richmond, refusing all interview requests, continuing her quiet life at the library. Morrison respected her wishes, but he kept her updated through brief phone calls, letting her know how the case had impacted Harlan. "The town is changing," he told her in early April. "Young women are talking about the case, about the pressure to marry, to conform. Your story is making people think differently." Margaret's response was quiet. "I never wanted to be a symbol detective. I just wanted to live my own life. I know, but sometimes our stories become bigger than us." There was a pause on the line. Then Margaret said, "There's something I need to do. I've been thinking about it since the trial ended. I need to go home. Not to stay. Just once. I need to see my parents' graves. I need to say goodbye properly." Morrison arranged everything with careful attention to Margaret's privacy. No press. No crowds. Just a brief visit to the cemetery on a Wednesday morning in late April when most people would be at work. He would drive her himself and ensure she could have the closure she needed. He picked her up at dawn in Richmond. Margaret sat in the passenger seat wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. Mountain laurel and wild roses. Flowers that grew in the Kentucky hills she'd left so long ago. They drove in comfortable silence through the mountains, watching the sun rise over the Cumberland Gap. As they crossed into Harlan County, Margaret's hands tightened on the flowers. "I haven't been back since November 13th, 1940, she said softly. 40 years next November." Morrison glanced at her. "How does it feel?" Margaret looked out the window at the familiar landscape. The steep hillsides, the narrow valleys, the creeks running clear now that the mines had mostly shut down. Strange. Like returning to a place that only exists in dreams. "Nothing looks quite how I remember it." They arrived at Pine Hill Cemetery just after 8 a.m. The morning mist still clung to the headstones. Morrison waited by the car while Margaret walked up the gentle slope to where her parents were buried side by side. William Whitfield, 1895 to 1952. Beloved husband and father. Dorothy Whitfield, 1897 to 1968. She never stopped believing. Margaret knelt between the graves, placing half the flowers on each. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Morrison looked away, giving her privacy for a grief 40 years delayed. When she finally returned to the car, her eyes were red but her face was peaceful. "She never stopped believing," Margaret said. "That's what it says on Mother's stone." Ruth told me Mother lit a candle for me every Sunday until her hands couldn't hold the match anymore. Morrison nodded. Your mother never accepted that you'd run away. She always insisted something had happened to you. She was right. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. They both died thinking I'd abandoned them. That's what I can't forgive. Thomas took my life, but he also stole my chance to ease their pain. They suffered because of what he did. They drove into town slowly. Harlan looked different, smaller, sadder. The mines that had employed thousands in 1940 were mostly closed. Main Street had empty storefronts. Henderson's dress shop where Margaret had worked was now a thrift store. On impulse, Margaret asked Morrison to stop. I want to see it. Just for a moment. They went inside. An elderly woman behind the counter looked up, then froze. Her hand went to her mouth. Margaret? Margaret stared. Mrs. Henderson? The woman's eyes filled with tears. Lord have mercy. I never thought I'd see you again. I'm not Mrs. Henderson anymore. She was my mother-in-law. I'm Clara. Clara Thompson. I worked at the shop with you. I was 17, you were teaching me to sew hems. Margaret's face softened with recognition. Clara. Little Clara who wanted to design wedding dresses. Clara came around the counter, moving slowly on arthritic knees. She took Margaret's hands. I read everything about the trial. What they did to you. I'm so sorry. We all thought you'd run away. If we'd known. You couldn't have known, Margaret said gently. I didn't even know what was happening at first. I just knew I woke up in that place and couldn't leave. Clara held her hands tighter. Your mother used to come here. Even years later, she'd walk by and look in the window, like she was hoping to see you at the sewing machine. It broke my heart every time. Margaret's composure cracked. I should have been here. I should have taken care of them. You were stolen from them, Clara said firmly. That's not the same as leaving. They knew you loved them. Your mother told me once that whatever happened to you, she knew it wasn't your choice. She knew you'd come back if you could. The two women stood there in the dusty thrift store that had once been a dress shop, holding hands across 40 years of lost time. Finally, Clara spoke again. I kept something. I probably shouldn't have, but I couldn't throw it away. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a wooden box. Inside was a dress. Cream silk with delicate beading, yellowed slightly with age but still beautiful. Your wedding dress. You'd finished it the week before you disappeared. Your mother couldn't bear to look at it, so she asked Mrs. Henderson to keep it. When Mrs. Henderson died, I took it home. I've kept it all these years. I always hoped somehow you'd come back for it. Margaret touched the silk gently. I made this. I remember every stitch. I was so proud of it. I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever created. It is beautiful, Clara said. You were so talented. You could have done anything. Margaret looked at the dress for a long moment. Then she carefully closed the box. Keep it, Clara. Or donate it, sell it, whatever feels right. That dress belongs to a girl who doesn't exist anymore. She died in that place, or maybe she just grew into someone else. Either way, I don't need it. Clara nodded, understanding. What will you do now? Will you stay in Richmond? Yes. I have a good life there. I have work I enjoy, friends, peace. That's enough. They hugged goodbye. As Margaret and Morrison walked back to the car, they saw people starting to recognize her, pointing, whispering. Morrison hustled her into the vehicle before anyone could approach. As they drove out of town, Margaret looked back one last time. I thought I'd feel something coming back here. Anger, maybe. Or grief. But mostly I just feel tired. Tired of carrying this story around. Maybe the trial gave you permission to put it down, Morrison suggested. Maybe. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Detective, can I ask you something? Why did you care so much? Why did you work so hard to solve a 40-year-old case that everyone else had forgotten? Morrison kept his eyes on the road. My grandfather died in a mine collapse when my father was 10 years old. The company said it was an accident, but everyone knew the safety violations, the corners cut to save money. Nobody was ever held accountable. My grandmother spent the rest of her life bitter because the truth never came out. Justice was never served. He glanced at Margaret. I became a cop because I believe the truth matters. Even decades later, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. You deserve to have your story told. Your parents deserved to know what happened to you. And Thomas Bennett deserved to answer for what he did. Thank you, Margaret said simply, for caring when no one else did. They drove back to Richmond in peaceful silence. When Morrison dropped her at her apartment, Margaret paused before getting out. Will you do something for me? Will you tell Ruth Palmer that I forgive her for moving on with her life? Tell her she was a good friend, and I'm glad she found happiness. Tell her not to feel guilty. I'll tell her, Morrison promised. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. And detective? You should visit sometime. Not about the case. Just to visit. The library has an excellent collection of true crime books. I think you'd appreciate the irony. Morrison laughed. I'll do that. He watched her walk into the building. A 62-year-old woman who had survived the unimaginable, who had rebuilt a life from nothing, who had chosen grace over bitterness. She disappeared through the door, and Morrison sat there for a moment, feeling like he'd witnessed something important. Not just justice, though there had been that, but survival. The quiet, determined survival of someone who refused to let cruelty define her. 5 years later, in the spring of 1985, Detective James Morrison stood in the Richmond Public Library holding a copy of a book that had just been published. The cover showed a simple image, a bird escaping from an ornate golden cage. The title read, The Girl Who Disappeared, One Woman's Story of Survival and Freedom. The author's name was listed as M.L. Winston. Margaret emerged from the back office, her silver hair now completely white, reading glasses hanging on a chain around her neck. She saw the book in his hands and smiled. You actually came, she said. I told you I would. Morrison held up the book. I got a copy yesterday. Finished it last night. Margaret, this is extraordinary. She gestured to a quiet corner of the library where they could talk. They sat in comfortable chairs near a window overlooking a small garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. I never planned to write it, Margaret said. But after the trial, I started getting letters. Hundreds of them. Women telling me their own stories. Abusive marriages they couldn't escape. Families that controlled every aspect of their lives. Dreams they'd given up because someone else decided their path. I realized my story wasn't just mine. It represented something larger. Morrison nodded. The response has been incredible. I heard you were on the Today Show last week. Margaret laughed softly. That was surreal. Katie Couric interviewing me about spending 27 years in a psychiatric facility. But people need to hear these stories. They need to understand that this kind of control, this kind of imprisonment, it still happens. Maybe not in facilities anymore, but in homes, in relationships, in families that use love as a weapon. The book has become required reading in some women's studies programs. Morrison said, You're making a difference. Margaret looked out the window at the garden. I'm 67 years old. I lost so much time, but these last 5 years, since the trial, I felt more alive than I did in my 20s. I'm finally living the life I was supposed to have. Tell me about it, Morrison urged. What have you been doing besides writing? Margaret's eyes lit up. I started teaching literacy classes here at the library. Adults who never learned to read properly. We meet twice a week. Watching someone read their first complete book. It's magical. And I volunteer at a women's shelter, helping women escape abusive situations. I tell them my story and I tell them it's never too late to start over. What about the dress shop? Did you ever think about going back to design? Actually, yes. Margaret pulled out her phone, a new technology she'd embraced enthusiastically, and showed him photos. I make quilts now. I take scraps of fabric, pieces that seem useless on their own, and turn them into something beautiful. It's therapeutic. I donate them to the shelter. Every woman who leaves gets a quilt to take with her. Something warm. Something made with care. Morrison felt his throat tighten. That's beautiful. Margaret put the phone away. What about you, detective? Still solving cold cases? Always. Morrison leaned back. Actually, I was promoted last year. I run the cold case unit now for the entire region. We've solved 6 cases in the past 2 years. Your case inspired the department to take these investigations seriously. I'm glad something good came from it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Morrison asked the question he'd been curious about for years. "Do you ever regret not going back to Harlan? Not confronting Thomas Bennett in person?" Margaret considered this carefully. "No. I gave my testimony. The truth came out. He's in prison. That's enough. Going back, facing him, that would have been for him, not for me. It would have given him a chance to ask forgiveness, to ease his conscience. He doesn't deserve that ease." She looked at Morrison steadily. "I learned something in those 27 years. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to give someone access to you. Thomas Bennett spent 40 years wondering what happened to me, building me into a mystery in his mind. Then he spent 5 years in prison knowing the truth, that I survived, that I thrived, that I built a life without him. That's my revenge. Not confrontation. Absence." Morrison understood. "What about Ruth? Do you two keep in touch?" Margaret smiled warmly. "Ruth comes to visit every few months. She brings her grandchildren sometimes. We have lunch, we talk about books, we laugh about things we did as girls. It's like no time passed at all, and also like everything has changed. She apologized for moving on with her life, and I told her that was ridiculous. I'm glad she had happiness. She named one of her daughters Margaret. Did you know that?" Morrison shook his head, smiling. "I didn't. Margaret Louise Palmer. She's 38 now, married, 2 kids of her own. Ruth brought her to meet me last year. It was strange and wonderful to meet someone named after me, carrying on that name in a life filled with choices and freedom." The library was beginning to fill with afternoon patrons. Students with backpacks, retirees looking for large print mysteries, mothers with small children heading to the storytime corner. Margaret watched them all with affection. "This is my life now," she said. "Books and people and quiet days. I wake up every morning in my own apartment, make my own coffee, choose my own clothes, decide my own schedule. These small freedoms that most people take for granted, I never do. Every choice I make is a gift." Morrison stood to leave. "Before I go, I have to tell you something. Thomas Bennett died last month. Heart attack in prison. I thought you should know." Margaret's face showed no emotion for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "How old was he?" 76. "So he lived 15 years after the trial. That's more than some people get." She paused. "I won't pretend to feel grief, but I won't celebrate either. His life was sad. He let his mother control him, and then he let guilt control him. He never learned to be free. In a way, we were both imprisoned by what happened. The difference is I eventually got out." Morrison handed her the book he'd been holding. "Would you sign this for me? For my daughter. She's 16. I want her to read it." Margaret took the book and wrote in careful script on the title page. When she handed it back, Morrison read what she'd written. "For Detective Morrison's daughter. Never let anyone tell you who you should be. The only life worth living is the one you choose for yourself. Your path is yours alone. Walk it with courage. M.L. Winston." "Perfect," Morrison said. "Thank you." They walked together to the library entrance. Outside, spring sunshine warmed the Richmond streets. People passed by going about their ordinary days, unaware that the kind librarian in the blue dress had survived something extraordinary. At the door, Margaret turned to Morrison one last time. "Detective, you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Not just justice. Closure. The ability to put down a burden I'd carried for decades. Thank you for that. Thank you for caring about a girl who disappeared so long ago that most people had forgotten she existed." "She didn't disappear," Morrison said firmly. "She was taken. And she survived. That's a story worth remembering." Margaret hugged him briefly, then returned to her work. Morrison watched through the window as she helped a young girl find a book, kneeling down to the child's level, pointing to different covers, making the girl smile. A woman who had lost so much, giving to others what she'd been denied. Choices, kindness, freedom. Morrison walked to his car, feeling the weight of the signed book in his hands. He thought about his daughter, about all the young women growing up in a world that still tried to dictate their paths, still tried to put them in golden cages. Margaret's story would help them understand that those cages could be escaped, that survival was possible, that life could be reclaimed even after the worst theft imaginable. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror. The library stood solid and permanent, a place of knowledge and refuge. Inside, Margaret Louise Whitfield, now Winston, continued her quiet revolution, one book recommendation at a time, one literacy student at a time, one quilt at a time. She had taken the pieces of her shattered life and sewn them into something new. Not the life she'd planned at 22, but a life nonetheless. Her life, chosen, free.